Okay guys, we already talked about our linear ambush, and now we're going to talk about our L-shaped ambush, and I wrote classical because this is the classical L-shaped ambush, or the classic ambush, if you will. So, what an L-shaped ambush is, it is both a parallel and a perpendicular ambush all at the same time. As you can see, our enemy, there's some pretty unlucky bastards in these scenarios, their direction of march. So now we not only have units arrayed perpendicular, but we have units arrayed parallel to them. So, what that means is that while they are receiving fire from the front and they maneuver to react to that fire, they're going to then be taking fire from the flank, or vice versa. So at any time, they're going to be receiving enfilade fire. So while they're taking cover from fire coming from one direction, they're now going to be receiving fire from their flank. So their chances of escaping an L-shaped ambush are much lower. All right, it's very, very difficult to escape a well-organized L-shaped ambush. All right, so you'll notice when we set this up, we still have our flank security. All right, we need to have more security now. All right, and in addition to having our flank security, we also now have to have potentially multiple rally points or a rally point farther away, because now our units are going to split into multiple pieces and they're not going to be able to all maneuver there at the same time without bunching themselves up and exposing themselves to the enemy while they're withdrawing. So, the L-shaped ambush is, bar none, the most effective ambush technique, but it is also the most difficult to coordinate. So if we look at the L-shaped ambush, you'll notice, all right, I put the friendly forces far enough back that we could see here. While these friendlies are engaging the enemy in enfilade fire, they must be cognizant of where they're firing their rounds to avoid potential friendly fire, or blue on blue. So what this requires is not only a high level of coordination to choose an ambush site correctly and effectively, but also high level of coordination to make sure that everybody has distinct sectors of fire so there's no friendly fire incident. So the unit commander has to really be on top of his game here, and he has to have very good coordination amongst all of his lower level unit commanders. And like we said before, in a designated time, when we withdraw, now we have to withdraw our units separately to our rally point before we can continue mission. We cannot have everybody withdraw at the same time because they're going to get in each other's way, but we still need to make sure that we regroup in the proper manner. Okay, the last type of ambush we're going to talk about is the L-shaped inverted ambush, or a 90-degree ambush. And so you can see what we have here. My forces are arrayed roughly in an L shape, in a 90-degree shape here on the inside, all right, with the enemy forces forced to go on the outside. Like I said before, how this is going to come to pass is if we have a terrain feature in this area here in which the enemy must go around, whether it's a mountain or a hill or impassable terrain such as bogs and marshes and things like that, or in urban environments, especially where roads make a big curve or a 90-degree turn and there's buildings blocking this route of travel. So now the enemy is forced to go around there. So as you can see, with all of my forces arrayed on the inside, but with our fires directed out, our coordination level is very high. We can travel and maneuver troops amongst ourselves at will, whereas the enemy is going to have a very difficult time in getting, one, communications from the front to the rear, because not only is there potentially terrain features in between, but also we're in between, the enemy's in between. But also, if they wanted to maneuver, they wanted to move troops from the front to the rear, or from the rear to the front, they now must travel the entire length of the ambush under fire to do so. It would be very difficult for them to do that. So, tactics like this have been used effectively in the past, especially on motorized columns. And one reason we might want to use a tactic like this on a motorized column is, one, if the enemy has particularly heavy or formidable weapons on one end of the column and we want to section them off from the rest. If we hit them with a perpendicular ambush or a parallel ambush and they're able to bring their firepower to bear instantly, that's bad news for us. But let's say we only have light anti-tank weapons and we want to engage an armored vehicle, but we want to let the heavily armored tanks of an enemy unit pass. So now, while the heavily armored units have already made this 90-degree turn and they're coming to pass, we're able to engage these units in the rear while keeping these units occupied, or vice versa, whatever the enemy's column arrangement may be. Another situation where this is very effective, and it's used a lot in Iraq, we ran into this all the time, was on major curves of the road, the enemy likes to plant IEDs on those big curves, because one, vehicles are forced to slow down when they make the curve, so they're easier targets, but typically they're going to hug the inside of the road, so they're going to be closer to where the IED, the mine, is buried. So that gives them a chance not only to set that off, but to potentially set up an ambush because now the vehicles are going to have to slow down on that turn. One other situation where this is very effective is in very restrictive terrain. Now, the Carthaginians used this against the Romans in the Battle of Lake Trasimene back in BC, I don't even remember when, but basically they had a very similar setup, and that while the Romans were marching, they also had water to their flank. And so with the Carthaginians set up on high terrain and with water to the flank of the Romans were unable to maneuver, even though they arguably had a much superior force. They were unable to maneuver, so they essentially just got pushed back into the lake and were forced to fight a very pitched battle in which they were decisively defeated. So again, inverted L-shaped ambush, very useful if we have a very key terrain feature that we can utilize, but also very dangerous if we don't coordinate very well. If the enemy has a very long column, or they have a humongous numerical advantage, we will be surrounded just in our very setup for the ambush. So know that when we're talking about the inverted ambush, this is not a good idea to do if you are a very small number compared to your enemy, or if you're going to have to be bunched in and they're able to surround you immediately. We need to be able to get out of here without getting everybody killed. So one last thing that we're going to talk about is just obviously that we have our flank and our rear security like every other type of ambush that we have, and we have our rally point that we're going to fall back to once we break down our ambush. So just like always, we've got to protect those flanks, got to protect that rear so we have an escape route. Much better that we escape the ambush than strictly stay there and die just to cause casualties.